In the year 1627, France stood at a crossroads between its Catholic monarchy and its Protestant minority, known as the Huguenots, who had carved out fortified strongholds in defiance of royal central authority. Nowhere was this defiance more pronounced than in La Rochelle, a wealthy Atlantic port that had prospered from trade, seafaring, and its deep Protestant identity. To King Louis XIII and his chief minister Cardinal Richelieu, the continued autonomy of La Rochelle represented not only a religious affront to the Catholic monarchy but also a dangerous political challenge to the consolidation of absolute power. The siege that followed would last over a year, turning the bustling city of more than 27,000 people into a starving prison of disease, desperation, and slow death, until only 5,000 battered survivors remained when the gates finally opened. This harrowing story became a defining moment of the struggle between royal power and Protestant independence in France, and it demonstrated Richelieu's ruthless resolve in breaking opposition through both strategy and sheer endurance. The origins of the siege can be traced to years of tension between the crown and the Huguenot communities. The Edict of Nantes, issued by Henry IV in 1598, had granted limited rights of worship and political autonomy to Protestants after decades of religious wars, but to Richelieu such autonomy was incompatible with the project of a strong centralized monarchy. La Rochelle stood as a beacon of Protestant independence, a well-fortified city with its own council, its own militia, and allies across Protestant Europe, particularly England and the Dutch Republic. Its port opened routes for merchants and sailors who were as willing to engage in smuggling and piracy as in legitimate trade, and its defiance of Catholic France made it an attractive partner for England's King Charles I, who sought both to support fellow Protestants and to challenge French influence on the continent. In 1627 the stage was set when England, eager to intervene in support of the Huguenots, dispatched a large fleet under the Duke of Buckingham. The English landed on the Ile de Ré, a strategic island guarding access to La Rochelle, in July of that year. They hoped to capture the island, secure the harbor, and establish a base from which La Rochelle could be supplied and reinforced. For the citizens of La Rochelle, this seemed like salvation. England, a Protestant power, had arrived to save them from Richelieu's tightening grip. Yet the English expedition was poorly executed, lacking sufficient coordination with the Rochellois and underestimating French resistance. By October, after heavy fighting and considerable loss, Buckingham's forces were driven back, and the Ile de Ré remained in French hands. The English retreat sealed La Rochelle's fate, for without outside support the city was now encircled by Richelieu's formidable blockade. The cardinal knew that direct assault on the well-defended city would be costly in lives, so he devised a strategy of attrition. His aim was to starve La Rochelle into submission. Over the course of 1627 and into 1628, Richelieu oversaw the construction of massive siege works, including a seawall across the harbor designed to cut the city off completely from the sea. This engineering feat, stretching nearly 4 kilometers, was built with extraordinary labor and resources, a testament to Richelieu's determination. Piles of stone, timber, and rubble were sunk to form the barrier, and heavy guns were placed to repel any attempt by English ships to break through. The land approaches were likewise ringed with forts and trenches, creating a stranglehold that tightened with each passing month. Inside La Rochelle, confidence initially ran high. The citizens believed in their walls, their faith, and the possibility of relief from England. The city's mayor, Jean Guidon, became a symbol of defiance, declaring that they would fight to the last man rather than surrender their Protestant freedom to Catholic tyranny. His speeches stirred the population, and the council resolved to endure whatever hardships might come. Yet as weeks turned to months, supplies dwindled, and hunger gnawed away at the resolve of even the most determined citizens. By winter, the scarcity of food became desperate. Grain stores emptied, meat vanished, and families resorted to eating horses, dogs, cats, and eventually rats. Leather was boiled into soup, weeds and roots were gathered from every corner, and still the hunger worsened. Disease spread in the weakened population, claiming thousands more lives. Parents watched children waste away, and despair hung over the once proud city like a shroud. Guidon and the council faced the impossible task of maintaining morale while their people starved, yet surrender was seen as betrayal, for they believed that submission to Richelieu would mean the end of their Protestant liberties and perhaps their very lives. Outside the walls Richelieu remained steadfast. He established his headquarters at the siege camp and personally supervised operations, a striking image of a minister who preferred diplomacy at court but who was willing to wage relentless war when necessary. To him the outcome was never in doubt, it was only a matter of time. He corresponded constantly with King Louis XIII, who occasionally visited the siege lines to demonstrate royal resolve. Together, King and cardinal presented a united front. La Rochelle must fall, and with it the last bastion of organized Protestant resistance in France. England attempted one last relief effort in 1628, dispatching another fleet to break the blockade. But Richelieu's seawall proved impenetrable, and the English attack failed. From the ramparts, the starving citizens of La Rochelle watched with hope as sails appeared on the horizon, only to see them retreat once more. The despair that followed was crushing, for they now knew no salvation would come. The blockade was complete, and death was inevitable unless they surrendered. By September 1628, the population of La Rochelle had been reduced from 27,000 to a mere 5,000 survivors, gaunt shadows of their former selves. Corpses littered the streets, and mass graves could no longer keep up with the toll. The council, seeing no alternative, entered negotiations with Richelieu. On October 28, 1628, after 14 months of unimaginable suffering, the gates of La Rochelle opened. The survivors, skeletal and broken, stumbled out to face their conquerors. Richelieu entered the city not with fire and sword, but with the satisfaction of victory achieved through patience and iron will. The terms of surrender were severe but not genocidal. The city's fortifications were demolished, and its political autonomy stripped away. Protestant worship was tolerated in limited form, in accordance with the still nominally valid Edict of Nantes, but La Rochelle would never again rise as an independent Protestant stronghold. It was transformed into a subdued port under royal authority, its walls replaced by royal garrisons, its council silenced. The symbolic power of its fall reverberated across France and Europe. The Huguenots had been broken, and Richelieu had shown that the crown would tolerate no rival centers of power. The human cost was staggering. Out of 27,000 inhabitants, only 5,000 survived, most of them weakened beyond recognition. The dead numbered more than 20,000, a catastrophe inflicted not by sword or cannon but by starvation and neglect. The slow, deliberate suffocation of a city became Richelieu's masterpiece of political military strategy, admired by some for its efficiency, condemned by others for its cruelty. It demonstrated his belief that the ends of state power justified the most ruthless means. In the aftermath, La Rochelle's fate served as a grim lesson to the rest of France's Protestant communities. Resistance was futile against the centralized might of the monarchy, and gradual submission followed across the kingdom. While Protestantism remained tolerated for a few more decades, its position was fatally weakened, and by the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, most Huguenots had fled into exile or converted under pressure. The Siege of La Rochelle had been the turning point, the moment when Protestant independence was crushed beneath Richelieu's calculated resolve. Historians often marvel at the engineering brilliance of the seawall, a structure that seemed impossible to construct in hostile waters under constant threat of attack, yet was completed with relentless determination. The wall not only blocked supplies but symbolized the unyielding barrier of royal authority. The soldiers and workers who built it endured hardship and danger, but they succeeded in creating one of the most remarkable siege works of the 17th century. For Richelieu, it was the embodiment of his philosophy: patience, control, and total domination of adversaries, whether at court or on the battlefield. For the people of La Rochelle, however, the memory was one of trauma. Generations later, the story of the siege was told as a testament to suffering and endurance, a tragedy of faith and politics where ordinary citizens bore the price of grand strategy. The names of Guidon and the defenders became part of Protestant memory, symbols of resistance even in defeat. The survivors who emerged in 1628 carried scars, physical and emotional, that would never heal, but their sacrifice became a legend of martyrdom within Huguenot circles. Beyond France, the siege was closely watched by Protestant Europe. England, the Dutch Republic, and other Protestant states saw it as a blow against their cause, yet their failure to aid La Rochelle effectively revealed the limits of international Protestant solidarity. Richelieu had not only starved a city but had also demonstrated to Europe that France was emerging as a centralized, disciplined, and formidable power under his guidance. This was the same Richelieu who would later dominate European politics through the 30 Years' War, always placing the interests of the French state above confessional allegiance. The Siege of La Rochelle was his rehearsal for the larger stage of Europe. The story of 27,000 reduced to 5,000 is one of the most haunting chapters of early modern France. It forces us to reflect on the nature of power, faith, and survival. Was the suffering of La Rochelle an inevitable outcome of religious conflict in a time when compromise was seen as weakness? Or was it a deliberate act of cruelty by a statesman determined to break his enemies at any cost? The answer lies somewhere in between. Richelieu believed that only by crushing resistance could France achieve unity, and in that belief he was successful. Yet the human cost remains a scar upon his legacy. In the end, the Siege of La Rochelle was not just the story of a city under starvation, but the story of a nation moving toward absolutism, of a monarchy asserting itself over religious pluralism, and of a minister whose vision of centralized power reshaped the destiny of France. The 5,000 survivors who emerged from the ruins were living witnesses to the terrible price of defiance. Their hollow eyes and wasted bodies told the world what it meant when politics and faith collided in the furnace of war. The walls of La Rochelle fell, but the memory of its suffering endures as one of the most poignant symbols of endurance and tragedy in European history. Background of Huguenot resistance and La Rochelle's role as the main Protestant stronghold in France. After decades of bloody religious wars, the Huguenots in France had been granted certain rights and protections under the Edict of Nantes in 1598, issued by King Henry IV. This landmark compromise allowed Protestant communities to worship freely in certain areas and maintain fortified cities as a guarantee of their safety. La Rochelle, already a thriving seaport on the Atlantic coast, quickly became the most important of these Protestant bastions. Its population embraced Calvinist faith with vigor, and the city developed not only as a religious center but also as a political and military one. The independence granted by the edict allowed La Rochelle to run its own affairs, with a council and mayor loyal to Protestant interests rather than the Catholic crown. This autonomy gave La Rochelle immense influence, but it also planted the seeds of inevitable conflict with the monarchy. As Catholic power grew under Louis XIII and his minister Cardinal Richelieu, the very existence of a fortified Protestant state within France came to be seen as intolerable. La Rochelle was not just another city, it was a symbol of Huguenot resilience and independence, and to Richelieu, its defiance was a direct threat to national unity and royal authority. Political and religious motivations of Cardinal Richelieu and King Louis XIII to suppress La Rochelle. Cardinal Richelieu, the architect of French absolutism, believed in the consolidation of all authority under the monarchy. To him, a divided France, split between Catholic and Protestant enclaves, was a weak France, vulnerable to both domestic rebellion and foreign influence. La Rochelle, in particular, stood out as a dangerous pocket of resistance, fortified and aligned with Protestant powers abroad. King Louis XIII shared Richelieu's concerns, though he often relied on the cardinal's ruthless vision to execute policy. For Richelieu, the issue was not merely theological but deeply political. Huguenot strongholds represented an alternate sovereignty within the kingdom. By maintaining armies, fortifications, and alliances beyond the king's control, they undermined the crown's authority. Suppressing La Rochelle would serve as both a religious victory and a political necessity, paving the way for centralized monarchy. It would also send a clear message to other dissenting nobles and communities that opposition to royal rule would not be tolerated. Thus, when conflict flared again in the late 1620s, Richelieu and Louis XIII saw an opportunity not just to bring La Rochelle into submission, but to finally break the spine of organized Protestant defiance in France, an act they believed essential for the stability of the kingdom. La Rochelle's strategic importance is a wealthy Atlantic port and center of Protestant trade. La Rochelle's importance was not merely ideological but also economic and military. As one of the richest ports on the Atlantic, it connected France to global trade networks stretching across the Americas, Africa, and Northern Europe. Merchants from La Rochelle thrived on commerce, including fishing, shipbuilding, and trade in wine and salt. The port was also a hub for privateers who raided Catholic shipping, further antagonizing the crown and giving the city the reputation of a rebel enclave. Its location on the Atlantic coast made it an ideal partner for Protestant England and the Dutch Republic, both of which shared commercial and religious interests with the Huguenots. For these reasons, La Rochelle became not only a symbol of Protestant freedom but also a vital link in Protestant Europe's strategy against Catholic powers. Militarily, its fortifications and natural harbor made it a formidable challenge to besiege. High stone walls and strong bastions guarded the land approaches, while the open sea provided potential lifelines for supply and reinforcements. To Richelieu, capturing La Rochelle was not simply about punishing religious dissenters, it was about seizing control of a critical maritime stronghold that could otherwise serve as a permanent foreign-backed foothold within France. The arrival of the English fleet under the Duke of Buckingham and the failed attempt to capture Ile de Ré. In the summer of 1627, the conflict at La Rochelle escalated dramatically with the intervention of England. King Charles I, eager to support his Protestant brethren and weaken French influence, dispatched a large fleet under his favorite, the Duke of Buckingham. The plan was to seize Ile de Ré, a small but strategically vital island guarding the approaches to La Rochelle. Once the island was secured, the English hoped to establish a base of operations, ensure supply lines into the city, and coordinate with the Huguenots inside the walls. At first, the English landing caused excitement among the Rochellais, who saw it as the beginning of salvation. But the campaign was poorly managed. Buckingham underestimated French defenses, and his forces suffered from lack of discipline and logistical problems. Fierce fighting around the fortified town of Saint-Martin-de-Ré drained the English, and French reinforcements gradually tightened the noose. By October 1627, after heavy losses, Buckingham was forced to withdraw his battered troops. For La Rochelle, the failure of the English expedition was a crushing blow. Their greatest ally had tried and failed to break through, leaving the city more isolated than before and facing the grim reality of a prolonged siege without reliable external aid. Initial optimism and confidence within La Rochelle under the leadership of Mayor Jean Guiton. Despite setbacks, the citizens of La Rochelle initially placed their hopes in their own defenses and the fiery leadership of Mayor Jean Guiton. A ship captain by trade, Guiton was elected mayor during the crisis and became the embodiment of Protestant resolve. Known for his uncompromising stance, he famously declared that he would rather see the city reduced to ashes than surrender to Catholic tyranny. Guiton rallied the council and inhabitants, encouraging them to place faith in God and their cause. Under his direction, the city prepared for a long resistance, supplies were rationed, weapons readied, and watchtowers manned. His charisma inspired both soldiers and civilians, convincing many that divine providence would protect them. The Rochellais believed that their formidable walls and strong bastions could resist French cannons and that foreign aid would eventually arrive. For months, Guiton maintained a fragile sense of unity, appealing to civic pride and religious faith. However, as the blockade tightened and the promised relief from England failed to materialize, even his fiery speeches began to lose their effect. Still, in those early months, La Rochelle stood proud, determined to defy Richelieu's armies, and convinced that their stand would preserve their Protestant liberties against overwhelming odds. Richelieu's decision to impose a blockade rather than storm the city directly. Cardinal Richelieu understood that a direct assault on La Rochelle's formidable defenses would be costly and uncertain. The city's walls were strong, its artillery well placed, and its defenders highly motivated. Instead, Richelieu chose the more patient but devastating strategy of blockade. He ringed the city with fortified camps and trenches, cutting off land approaches and controlling all roads into La Rochelle. His forces monitored every path, ensuring that no food or supplies could enter. This strategy was not glamorous, but it was effective. Richelieu knew that no matter how high the walls, hunger would eventually conquer the defenders. His decision revealed his strategic genius. Rather than wasting soldiers in bloody assaults, he would let famine do the work. The blockade was not only physical but also psychological. Each day the Rochellais watched their supplies dwindle, their hope of relief grow weaker, and the presence of enemy camps remind them of their isolation. By choosing starvation as his weapon, Richelieu transformed the siege into a slow death sentence for the city. It was a ruthless but calculated choice, demonstrating his cold pragmatism and his determination to crush resistance with minimal losses to his own army. Construction of the massive seawall across the harbor to cut off supplies by sea. The most remarkable feature of the siege was the construction of a colossal seawall across the harbor of La Rochelle. Richelieu understood that as long as the sea remained open, foreign allies, particularly England, could attempt to supply the city. To eliminate this lifeline, he ordered an immense barrier to be built across the channel, a project unprecedented in scale at the time. Stretching nearly 4 kilometers, the seawall was constructed by sinking ships filled with stone and piling rubble and timber atop them. Despite storms, tides, and harassment from Rochellais ships, Richelieu's workers persevered. The project required immense manpower, resources, and coordination, but by early 1628 the barrier was complete. Heavy guns were mounted along it to repel any English attempts to break through. This engineering feat was both practical and symbolic. It demonstrated Richelieu's relentless determination and his ability to mobilize resources on a grand scale. For the citizens of La Rochelle, the sight of the seawall closing their harbor was a devastating blow, extinguishing their last hope of resupply by sea. With both land and sea sealed, the city was trapped, isolated, and left to the mercy of famine. Richelieu had created a prison that no force could penetrate. The gradual tightening of the land and sea blockade around the city. With the seawall completed and the land blockade entrenched, La Rochelle found itself completely isolated. Richelieu's forces maintained constant vigilance, intercepting any attempt to smuggle supplies into the city. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, while artillery batteries kept pressure on the defenders. The blockade became a slow strangulation, squeezing the life out of the city day by day. From outside the walls, the French army could hear the church bells and see the proud banners of La Rochelle, but they knew that inside hunger was taking its toll. Richelieu, always calculating, kept the blockade tight but avoided unnecessary assaults, preferring to let famine do its work. His strategy was tested by occasional skirmishes and minor sorties by the defenders, but the superiority of his numbers ensured control. At sea, French ships and the seawall guns prevented English vessels from approaching. Even when supply ships attempted daring runs, they were destroyed or turned back. Each failure deepened the despair within the city. The blockade became more than a military tactic, it was psychological warfare. The people of La Rochelle knew they were alone, and every passing week made surrender appear less like defeat and more like survival. The onset of famine inside La Rochelle and the descent into eating animals, leather, and roots. By the winter of 1627-1628, famine gripped La Rochelle with merciless force. The granaries had been emptied, livestock consumed, and what little food remained was rationed to the smallest portions. Soon, desperate citizens turned to eating horses, dogs, cats, and eventually rats. Leather from belts, boots, and saddles was boiled into broth. Grass, weeds, and roots were pulled from every patch of earth. Families starved together, and children cried for food that did not exist. The once thriving city of merchants and sailors had been reduced to scenes of misery. Hunger gnawed not only at bodies but also at the spirit of resistance. People debated whether it was better to surrender and live or to persist in defiance and perish. Yet Mayor Jean Guidon and the council continued to urge endurance, fearing that surrender would bring religious persecution. The spectacle of entire households wasting away became common, and corpses were left in the streets as survivors lacked strength for proper burials. Hunger became the most powerful weapon Richelieu wielded, breaking down morale in a way no cannon could. By spring, the population had already shrunk drastically, with thousands. Spread of disease, mass deaths, and the psychological despair of the starving population. As famine weakened the people, disease spread with terrifying speed. Malnutrition made the population vulnerable to fevers, dysentery, and infections. The lack of sanitation compounded the crisis, as garbage and unburied corpses filled the streets. In the confined, overcrowded city, sickness passed from household to household. Families watched as children and elders succumbed, and neighbors wasted away before their eyes. The death toll mounted so high that mass graves overflowed, and the smell of decay became a constant presence. Beyond the physical suffering, the psychological despair was immense. Once proud merchants and sailors now begged for scraps of food, their dignity stripped away by hunger. The belief that God might intervene began to falter, and some questioned whether their leaders had condemned them to death out of stubborn pride. The will to resist cracked under the weight of misery, yet still the council clung to defiance, convinced that surrender would mean religious annihilation. The emotional toll was devastating. Hope faded with each failed relief attempt, and despair settled over the population. By mid-1628, La Rochelle was no longer a functioning city but a graveyard in slow motion, where death came as both an enemy and a release from suffering. England's second failed attempt to relieve La Rochelle in 1628. Despite the failure of the Duke of Buckingham's earlier expedition, England made one last attempt to save La Rochelle in 1628. A fleet was dispatched to break Richelieu's blockade and open supply lines into the city. The starving inhabitants placed all their remaining hope on this intervention, watching anxiously from the walls as the sails of English ships appeared on the horizon. But Richelieu's seawall, guarded by heavy guns and reinforced positions, proved impregnable. The English assault was disorganized and met with fierce resistance. Cannon fire rained down on the attackers, and the fleet, unable to penetrate the barrier, eventually retreated. From within La Rochelle, the sight of their supposed saviors turning back was shattering. Hope, already fragile, collapsed entirely. The realization that no help would come destroyed the last vestiges of morale. The defenders knew they were truly alone, trapped between starvation and surrender. Richelieu's seawall had achieved its purpose, proving not only a tactical success but also a psychological one. The English withdrawal sealed the fate of the city. For the Rochellais, the retreat of their allies was the moment. When resistance turned into resignation, and the long agony neared its inevitable end. Negotiations and eventual surrender of La Rochelle after 14 months of siege. By the autumn of 1628, La Rochelle was broken. After 14 months of hunger, disease, and despair, only a fraction of its original population remained alive. The once defiant city could no longer function, its streets were filled with corpses, and its survivors were skeletal and weakened. Faced with extinction, the council finally entered negotiations with Richelieu. The terms were strict but unavoidable. On October 28, 1628, the gates of La Rochelle opened, and the starving survivors stumbled out to meet their conquerors. Richelieu entered the city not as a destroyer but as a victor who had achieved his goal through endurance rather than assault. The surrender marked the end of Protestant independence in France. For the citizens, it was the end of their dream of religious and political autonomy, though some form of Protestant worship was still technically protected under the Edict of Nantes. The symbolic power of the surrender was immense. The proud Protestant stronghold had been reduced to submission by sheer starvation. Richelieu had proven that resistance to royal power was futile, and his reputation as the mastermind of absolutism was solidified. Terms of surrender, demolition of fortifications, and loss of political autonomy. The conditions imposed on La Rochelle following its surrender were designed to eliminate its ability to ever resist again. The city's fortifications, once the pride of its people and the bulwark of Protestant independence, were systematically demolished. Its political council was stripped of authority, and the governance of the city passed firmly under royal control. The mayor and leaders who had championed resistance were removed or subdued, ensuring no further challenges to Richelieu's authority. While Protestant worship was not outright abolished, it was confined and tightly regulated. The city was no longer allowed to maintain its own militia, fortifications, or independent foreign connections. In essence, La Rochelle was transformed from an autonomous Protestant republic into a subdued royal port. These terms represented more than just the defeat of a city, they signaled the end of Huguenot political power in France. Other Protestant communities quickly understood the message: resistance would no longer be tolerated. For Richelieu and Louis XIII, this outcome marked a decisive victory in the struggle to centralize authority. For the people of La Rochelle, however, it meant humiliation, loss of freedom, and the destruction of the institutions that had defined their identity for generations. Human cost of the siege: over 20,000 dead, only 5,000 survivors. The most harrowing legacy of the siege was the staggering human toll. Out of a population of more than 27,000, only about 5,000 survived. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion claimed more than 20,000 lives in 14 months, a catastrophe unmatched in France's 17th century history. These deaths were not the result of battle but of deliberate starvation imposed by Richelieu's blockade. Entire families perished, leaving houses empty and neighborhoods silent. Survivors emerged as walking skeletons, too weak to bury the dead or rebuild their city. The scale of the tragedy shocked contemporaries across Europe. Some praised Richelieu's determination as a model of strategic brilliance, but others condemned the cruelty of deliberately starving a civilian population into submission. For the Protestant world, La Rochelle became a symbol of martyrdom, remembered not only for its resistance but also for the suffering endured by its inhabitants. The catastrophe stripped the city of its former prosperity and vitality, and recovery took decades. The human cost served as both a warning to others who might defy the crown and as a reminder of the terrible price ordinary people pay when politics and faith collide in relentless conflict. Long-term consequences: weakening of French Protestantism, strengthening of royal absolutism, and Richelieu's rising dominance in European politics. The fall of La Rochelle marked a turning point in French history. For the Huguenots, it was the end of political independence. While limited freedom of worship technically remained under the Edict of Nantes, their ability to resist militarily was shattered. Over the following decades, Protestant influence steadily declined, culminating in the revocation of the edict in 1685, which forced many into exile. For the crown, the victory at La Rochelle was a triumph of absolutism. Richelieu had proven that no rival power, religious or political, could stand against the centralized authority of king and state. The demolition of La Rochelle's fortifications symbolized the dismantling of Huguenot autonomy and the triumph of Catholic monarchy. Beyond France, the siege elevated Richelieu's reputation as one of Europe's most formidable statesmen. His success at La Rochelle showcased his ability to blend strategy, patience, and ruthless determination. It also prepared France for its larger role in the 30 Years' War, where Richelieu would guide French policy to dominate European affairs. The siege, therefore, was more than a local tragedy, It was a watershed moment in the rise of France as a centralized, powerful state, and in the relentless pursuit of unity.